Greetings, fillies and gentle colts. I'm Earl. How do these guys keep breaking in? I have an army for a reason.
Hey, my name is Sure Reviewer Alpha Plus 234. Can you look at my content?
It seems I have a lot of teaching to do. Greetings, fillies and gentle colts. I am Onyx the Dragon, and I'm actually going to be doing something a bit different today. Rather than actually critique anyone, I wanted to help those of you out there become better analysts. This video is probably going to be a bit shorter, but hopefully you all find it useful.
Wait, isn't there other tutorials already?
Ignore him, he's incompetent. Now, Anne of Dreams has already done a phenomenal video on this, and I highly recommend watching it if you haven't already. It's really well put together and still holds mostly true today, even though it's 2 years old. However, in my year or so as an analyst, I've found a few other examples and pointers that the video doesn't have, and I wanted to share those with you, so consider this an unofficial patch of sorts. Firstly, video editing software. I still recommend you use something expensive and flexible like Sony Vegas, Premiere Pro, or Adobe Flash, but there are actually a few decent options for those on the lower end of the income spectrum as well. These all, to my knowledge, let you use layers and export in 16:9, both of which are required if you're going to be even passable. First is VSDC. From what I hear, it's very similar to Premiere Pro, and it has a lot of the options you'd find in a higher-end program. It's what I've used for literally all of my videos, in fact, and for the low price of free. The only drawback is that it's not particularly stable and likes to crash a lot, so you're going to want to save very often, especially if you have a lot going on the screen. But then you should be doing that anyway. Next is DaVinci Resolve. My computer can't run it, unfortunately, so I can't really speak for stability, but from what I've seen, it's very robust and either matches or dwarfs VSDC in about every way. There's a free version, but be aware that it requires a 64-bit CPU and doesn't work too well if you aren't using a newer computer. But if you've got the hardware to run it and for whatever reason don't have the money for a more mainstream editor, I would consider giving it a try. Next, onto the OC design.
Oh, can you look at my OC too?
Oh, sweet Celestia. Yes, vectors are still a must. Most of these are, in fact. And before you try it, Blackbird's already Bernalysis Ed Wood. Now, this might blow your minds a bit, but unless you're an artist, I'm going to recommend you make your OC a regular pony, or at least something very similar like a changeling. The main reason for this is that getting vectors for an OC that is, say, a dragon for example, is an absolutely hellish process, and it's not getting easier anytime soon. Commissions are very expensive, and bases don't really exist, so unless you're willing to recolor a show character or get lucky and find a vector you can edit into a decent puppet like I did, you're not going to do very well in the art department. The only real exception to this is if you happen to have an artist friend who will draw your vectors for you like Wooden Sword did.
But I don't have any friends.
That sounds like a you problem. Now stop interrupting me. As for getting vectors of your hopefully a pony OC, there are several options, most obvious among them being commissions. For these, I highly recommend commissioning a full-out puppet rather than individual vectors if possible, because you'll probably save money in the long run and can add more to it later on if you ever happen to learn how to draw. Just make sure that either the puppet is for a program you have, or that you get the layers as individual image files so you can put them into your program of choice yourself. After all, a puppet you can't use is kind of worthless now, isn't it? On the other hand, if you happen to be strapped for cash, you could always try bases instead, which are completely free. If you decide to go this route, however, you will need to do some of the art yourself.
Do I look pretty now?
Ignoring you! The last option is to get good and simply draw your own regardless and hope they come out. If you decide to go on this path, there's a great tutorial by Lightning Bliss that should get you started. It only costs as much as your art program. I recommend something decent and with a price tag, though you could probably get away with Paint.net. Also free. The drawbacks here are that 1, it takes time to draw, especially if you're inexperienced, and 2, if it doesn't come out that great, you'll probably have to revisit the vectors again later. On the plus side though, this may open the door to becoming an artist in addition to an analyst or reviewer. But regardless of which option you choose, I cannot stress enough that you should credit the artist. That is, unless you want to risk becoming the next lovely, of course, in which case you're either braver or stupider than most. Next, I want to give some advice in regards to the analyst spectrum Anne proposed. While most of us aren't really those gems who are both insightful and charismatic, I highly recommend you try to be, as this will result in both the best content and the largest viewer base. This is probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do as a content creator, and it'll never really get any easier, but it is possible.
But I thought this would be easy. It looks easy.
If you tend to be on the dry technical side, consider substituting a pony-sona for a true OC that still reflects your own perspective. Take me for example, I'm a very dry, nihilistic, and pessimistic arse IRL. I do have a fascination in villain characters and technology though, so playing the Dr. Doom style villain that I do in Onyx the character comes rather naturally and still fits my IRL personality, as his perceptions and opinions still mirror my own quite closely, even though he's a much more interesting person to talk to. If you happen to fall on the charismatic side on the other hand, consider writing every video as if you were trying to do well on an exam paper for school. It sounds like a chore, but if you're really passionate about this, it will eventually come to you. I'll be elaborating on how momentarily. And finally, how to avoid being, as Aeon coined it, the half-assed recap. I'll give you a few examples to study in a moment, but consider these rules of thumb for now. Number 1. Adjectives are your enemy. If I say, oh, this episode is bad or poorly written or so on, it's just a claim. The important part of a good review is why. Why is this episode good or bad? Why was Twilight out of character? Why is this episode a portrayal of the 5 stages of grief? You get the idea. Number 2, examples are your friend. This works hand in hand with the first rule. If you don't use any adjectives and don't explain yourself, well, you get a big pile of nothing. Go look at any of my earlier videos for an example, hint, of what this looks like. You must substitute adjectives with reasons and examples. Consider the following for instance. Number 1, Ember is a bad character because she's too simple. Number 2, Ember is a bad character because she's one-dimensional. She is portrayed as a tsundere tomato, but beyond that, we don't know anything about her. It's a single archetype that anyone could have written. Notice how the second statement explains how and why Ember is a flawed character, while the first one doesn't. I feel the contrast speaks for itself, but even the second statement is actually a bit simplistic. It explains itself, but there's no examples. Now let's try adding one and see what happens. Ember is a bad character because she's one-dimensional. She's portrayed as a tsundere tomato, but beyond that, we don't know anything about her. In Gauntlet of Fire, we're told she's supposed to be smart in addition to this, but it's actually Spike who comes up with most of the ideas that got her to the position of Dragon Lord. We're told that she's smart, but all we're shown of this is her choosing to ally herself with Spike, and even this is hard to justify, as Ember couldn't have known he'd come up with the ideas that took them to victory. This leaves us with the tsundere tomato trait exclusively. It's a single archetype that anyone could have written. See how this example makes the points of why Ember is one-dimensional almost painfully obvious? It's very easy to see why the writer of this statement feels the way they do. The difference between this and the first one is night and day. Also, for those of you charismatic people I spoke about a little bit ago, this is how you be insightful in case you're struggling. Believe it or not, we can actually take this third statement even further. For instance, giving an additional example of Ember being a tsundere tomato. This can go on almost endlessly, but I won't here for the sake of time. A good review or analysis video is just a bunch of statements like the third strung together around a specific topic. Now let's look at whole videos and see what a difference this makes. To do this, I've found 2 sets of videos from the same creators, those being Sharp Wit and Wooden Sword. The older ones do very little to explain themselves and come off more as recaps, while the latter have much more in the way of actual analysis. They come from the same channel, so almost everything else besides this is about the same between both videos. It's a very easy contrast to work with, so I suggest you study it. This is, after all, how I got better.
All of the performers are unique and have their own special personalities and work well off another. And that's really cool. I like it.
Now, there's something that bothers me. Not the impersonation, that was pretty funny, although I have seen better ones. She did a better one in Newbie Dash, okay? That's my opinion. Twilight is the princess of friendship, but she's telling Rainbow and Pinky to use bits to get info. The Twilight I know would instead use the power of compliments and friendship to befriend them and get help. She obviously doesn't know what's happened to Griffonstone since the story she read ended with the coronation of the 14th King of the Griffins, so I assume they'll only answer to bits.
Thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share. This is Onyx the Dragon, signing out.